of the Padron system that lets you get rich in 10 years. It was chaotic, layered, and incredibly dynamic.
And we learned that George Rolfs, that highly successful man the writer envied, fell seriously ill and died shortly after these accounts were written. It just makes you consider how quickly prosperity and health could shift in that environment, and what it must have taken for Rolfs's widow, a woman left alone in this volatile city, to maintain his villas, to make sure they were available for future European expeditions. It connects that intense personal tragedy of the elite directly to the much larger geopolitical story of North Africa.
When we read the grand narratives
Yeah.
of 19th century exploration, the famous names, the memoirs, we often find that the truly essential people are, well, they're relegated to the footnotes.
Exactly. The ones who had the critical, on-the-ground knowledge.
And that is the perfect setup for today's deep dive.
It really is. We have a rich stack of primary accounts here, mostly excerpts from the journals of European explorers like Heinrich Barth and Gerhard Rolfs. Our job for you is to synthesize these sometimes contradictory observations into a portrait of one of those crucial figures, Mohammed el-Qatruni.
He sounds important.
Oh, he was the vital connection, the indispensable link for nearly every major expedition moving between Tripoli and the formidable region of Fezzan during the 1850s and 60s.
So we're not just talking about a simple guide here. We're talking about a highly skilled professional whose life intersects with some of the biggest names in African exploration.
Right. And the initial fact that emerges from these sources is, well, it's really telling about the complexity of the era. Mohammed el-Qatruni first shows up as a young photographer.
A photographer? From where?
From Berlin, actually. He accompanied Rolfs's expedition to Cyrenaica. The sources note that after his technical work was done, he was then tasked with, managing the housekeeping.
So wait, he's taking pictures 1 minute and then handling logistics the next.
Exactly. Think about that combination. Technical skill, maybe from European training, paired with the rugged, essential labor of desert travel. That duality immediately signals that this is an individual who defied the neat boxes European observers tried to put him in.
Okay, let's unpack this wide range of expertise, because it suggests his identity was really fluid and pragmatic. He wasn't just a photographer.
Or just an attendant. He was a professional traveler, a companion, an expert. This was mission-critical stuff.
And the sources seem to reflect this confusion about who he was.
Perfectly. What's so fascinating is if you trace the chronology of his relationships, particularly with Heinrich Barth, because Barth's assessments are rather wonderfully contradictory.
Oh, they clash.
Completely. So el-Qatruni first enters Barth's employment in Merzouk. That's deep in Fezzan, back in May of 1857.
And what's Barth's initial take on him? It sounds like he was pretty glowing at first.
Oh, full of praise. He called him our best and most steady servant and described him simply as a nice youth.
A nice youth.
Yeah, and he even made a point of documenting el-Qatruni's excellent temperament under pressure, noting how stoically he handled being bitten by a scorpion.
Wow. So immediate trust, reliability, poise. That's the first picture we get.
That's the one. He seems like the ideal employee. But this is where the portrait starts to, well, fracture a bit.
Suggesting that Barth, even though he relied on him for his very survival, carried some deep-seated biases.
He must have. In a subsequent journal entry, Barth just pivots drastically. In what seems like a moment of really shallow personal reflection, Barth later described el-Qatruni as having a most unattractive appearance.
That's an incredible thing to write down about a man who basically holds your life in his hands.
It is shallow, but the context that follows is what really matters. For all his personal judgment, Barth just couldn't deny the man's professional value.
So he walks it back.
Immediately. He qualifies that harsh physical assessment by stating unequivocally that el-Qatruni was the most useful attendant I ever had. The superficial judgment were just instantly erased by the undeniable truth of his capability.
So his utility literally transcended the prejudices of his employer. But we have to ask, what made him so uniquely useful?
It was his deep immersion in the geography and the culture. Barth gives us the context. Mohammed el-Qatruni had already roamed a great deal over the whole eastern half of the desert.
So he wasn't learning the routes with them.
No, he was the route. He had the essential high-value knowledge of landscape, logistics, survival, diplomacy. And crucially, his reputation ensured his employment. He had a strong sense of honor and was perfectly to be relied upon.
I mean, when you're days from help in the Sahara, that level of competence is everything.
It's the difference between success and catastrophic failure.
That deep immersion and high reputation must have shifted the dynamic over time. The relationship Especially later, it seems to evolve far beyond a simple master-servant dynamic.
We definitely see that shift. When he briefly returned to Barth's service in 1855, Barth made another complicated entry. He noted that El Catruni's conduct proved almost unacceptable at that time.
Unacceptable, but wait.
Yet he served with the strictest fidelity. This is the core conflict. How can conduct be unacceptable while fidelity is strictest?
That raises a great question for you, the listener. What did Barth find so unacceptable? If the work itself was flawless, maybe the unacceptable conduct was simply El Catruni asserting his boundaries.
That's a key insight.
She was a professional hired for specialized skills, not a valet. Maybe he just refused to do things he felt were beneath his standing.
It suggests he was pushing back against the social hierarchy of the expedition. He knew his worth. And we see proof of his high status in other accounts, too. He's mentioned multiple times in the reminiscences of Dixon, the young liberated slave, who was also part of this network.
And his career arc only reinforces this idea of independence. He didn't stay tied to one explorer.
Not at all. He was a companion to Rolfs, part of the inner circle with Bornu and Mandara, and even the camel they named Tuareg. But he was always free to look for better opportunities.
Right, there's evidence of that.
Absolutely. By 1862, he was actively seeking other work. He wanted to work for Moritz von Berman. He wasn't bound by some long-term contract.
And that professional autonomy really culminates 4 years later, 1866.
Yes. In Merzuk, he parts ways with Rolfs. He plans to take up work with another explorer, Hornstein, but he makes his decision clear. He explicitly stated he would undertake no more long journeys with Rolfs.
He's setting professional limits.
Yeah.
And prioritizing his personal life.
Exactly. And what we learn about his domestic life confirms that pivot. The sources note he returned to Tripoli after marrying Mandara's sister. This is a man making conscious life choices, prioritizing connection over the constant instability of exploration.
Which brings us to what is, for me, the most human and detailed part of all this.
The incredible physical and habitual details recorded when he was older, these observations just elevate him from a name in a journal to a person you can almost picture.
Let's dive into that later portrait because it's such a stark contrast to the nice youth Barth first met. It tells a story of survival.
The later descriptions are almost cinematic. They paint this image of an old man marked by time. Wrinkles, a small snub nose, wide nostrils, a toothless mouth.
A tough life, clearly.
A very tough life. A sparse beard with black and white hairs. But beneath it all, the observer noted his faithful eyes. It's such an honest, unvarnished depiction.
And his temperament seems to reflect that endurance, too. Kind of quiet confidence.
He was described as quiet, friendly old man, and not a man of many words. The sources say he seldom allowed his natural equanimity to be disturbed. He didn't show exaggerated emotion. He was just steady, focused, unruffled.
A crucial temperament for a diplomat and a survivalist.
Mm-hmm. But the detail I find most compelling, the one that makes him so tangible, is the very specific ritual he followed when his work was interrupted.
Ah, yes, this is fantastic. It's the kind of tiny anecdote that just puts you right there in the moment.
This is where we get into the material culture. So when someone interrupted him, he would pause, push his work aside, and follow this precise ritual. First, he'd take a pinch of coarsely pounded green tobacco leaf from a small leather pouch.
Okay.
And put it into his mouth.
But he didn't stop there, right?
No. Immediately after the tobacco, he would bite off a piece of a lump of natron.
And natron is, for our listener, essentially trona, a mineral.
Exactly, a naturally occurring sodium carbonate found in desert basins. And the sources explicitly note that chewing this trona was his appropriate corrective to the tobacco.
You can almost smell it. That earthy tobacco, then the alkaline tang of the mineral.
It wasn't just a habit. It was a customary, maybe even a chemical corrective, deeply ingrained.
And even as he settled down, his sense of honor, his concern for his network, that remained.
It did. One of his final documented acts was insisting that Rolfs take Benalua, a slave boy, with him on his journey to Montgomery. This wasn't about employment. It was about ensuring the well-being of someone in his circle.
His influence didn't just extend to people and customs, but to the very infrastructure of the journey itself. To really understand his expertise, we have to look at the practical knowledge in these narratives. Let's talk about the Hawiya.
The camel saddle?
The vital camel saddle.
The Hawiya is a perfect example of applied, highly specialized knowledge. The sources detail its construction meticulously. It's made from a robust bag of camel hair cloth, about 2 meters long and nearly a meter wide.
That's huge. Not the small saddle we might picture.
Far from it. It's flat at first, but then it's painstakingly stuffed with straw or dried grass. And crucially, the stuffing is divided into two distinct halves.
So when it's sewn up,
You have two long, heavily padded, sausage-shaped halves.
it's an engineering solution tailored specifically for a camel's anatomy and the desert terrain.
Precisely. These two padded halves encircle the camel's hump. The design, with the free ends at the front and the seam at the back, allows the saddle to bend.
And why is that bending so important?
It distributes the weight evenly. It protects the camel's hump from rubbing and injury on rocky ground. I mean, if your camel goes lame because of a bad saddle, the entire expedition just stops.
That detail connects directly back to El Catrini's utility. The famous explorers were mapping, but men like him knew how to physically protect the transport. They held the practical knowledge for daily survival.
It's the difference between theoretical geography and applied logistics. The Europeans might know where they want to go, but the guides knew how the caravan could physically get there.
Okay, let's bring this all back together for you, the listener.
Mm-hmm.
We started this deep dive with a young photographer from Berlin. And through these fractured yet incredibly detailed accounts, we've traced his journey to becoming an essential, fiercely independent logistical consultant across the Sahara.
He was a man defined by these productive contradictions. Unattractive, but indispensable. A nice youth who later showed unacceptable conduct, yet was faithful to the end.
And he made a conscious, autonomous choice to prioritize his life in Tripoli after a career of high-stakes expertise.
The key takeaway here is that figures like Muhammad el-Katruni were never passive servants. They were complex historical actors. High-value consultants whose expertise in everything from photography to the material culture of the Hurriya was the fundamental infrastructure the whole era of exploration was built on.
We've pieced together an astonishing amount about him. His character, his work ethic, his customs.
But here's the provocative thought to carry with you. If Barth and Rolfs, men who relied on him completely, could offer such starkly contradictory assessments of him across just a few years, what essential parts of Muhammad el-Katruni's own story, the one he never wrote, do we still need to decipher from these small observations left behind?
What did the great consultant truly think of his employers? That's something to mull until the next time we dive in.
Okay, let's say you're about to set out on a major trek. A long-distance journey, deep into the world's most desolate landscapes. What's the single most critical piece of equipment you're relying on?
You know, most people would probably say water.
That's what I'd say. Water, or maybe a compass or some kind of navigation tool.
And it's logical to think that because those things are so immediately tied to survival.
Yeah.
But our source material today, this really fascinating historical account on the logistics of desert expeditions, it tells a very different story. It's not the water, it's the camel saddle.
I love that. The saddle isn't a luxury item. It's the foundation of everything, of all logistical efficiency and, well, therefore, of survival itself.
Exactly.
And this particular account gives us this astonishingly detailed look at how these, seemingly simple saddles were built and the intense provisioning you needed for a journey to succeed.
Right. Our mission today is to go far beyond that sort of romantic image of a caravan. We're going to uncover how these really detailed design decisions about wood, about stuffing, about rope made centuries ago, how they meant the difference between comfort, efficiency, and just outright disaster.
For both the camel and the traveler.
For both, it's a real deep dive into the historical realities of efficient transport.
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with the saddle itself. Because when I visualize a camel saddle, I'm just picturing a big, soft cushion strapped over the hump, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the source reveals it's this ingenious load-bearing mechanism. It's far more complex than a pile of padding.
Oh, absolutely. What's crucial to understand is that the saddle isn't one solid piece that just sits on the spine. It's an elaborate frame.
The frame.
Yeah. The core structure is a strong, wide wooden brace placed over the camel's back. And this brace is then secured by fastening straps underneath the animal to its belly. That wooden brace itself, it functions as a small secondary saddle.
So the wood isn't just holding things together. It's a structural element that's designed to distribute force. Why is that specific structure so important for efficiency?
Stability. It's all about stability. The entire success of the transport, the serviceability of that saddle, it all depends on two things.
Okay.
First, the efficiency and quality of the stuffing that pads that brace. And second, the absolute unwavering solidity of the wooden frame itself. It must not shift. It can't compress or move because that brace is designed to hold steady under hundreds of pounds of cargo moving for 8-10 hours a day.
this is where the physics of it all gets really interesting to me. The actual burden, the cargo, the baggage, it isn't sitting directly on the camel's spine or even directly on that wooden brace, not like a rider on a horse.
Precisely. The secret is in the engineering of the attachment. The load is carried by the cords which join the two halves of the camel's total load.
To two halves.
So it distributes that weight laterally across the animal's ribs and flanks, not vertically down onto the spine.
That seems almost counterintuitive. Why is carrying the weight laterally with cords better than having it sit right on the back?
Well, think about a modern high-end hiking backpack. That pack doesn't just rest all its weight on your shoulders.
Right.
That would compress your spine.
Right. It uses a frame to push it down to your hips.
Exactly. It transfers the weight to your hips, which are much better at bearing that load.
Yeah.
This historical saddle does the same thing for the camel. By distributing the load through those cords on the sides, the weight is pulled sideways and downward. It maximizes the efficiency of the strongest parts of the animal's back and ribs, and it minimizes that harmful pressure on the supersensitive spine.
That distribution is brilliant, but I can just imagine how easily it could fail if the assembly is even slightly off. What are the critical risks that the source identifies?
There are two main risks, and they're both catastrophic.
Mm.
The first one is all about the structure and the padding. If the frame is improperly fitted, or even just a little too wide, it forces the padding and stuffing to compress in a really unhealthy way.
And when that padding compresses, the whole system just fails, right?
It absolutely fails. Once the stuffing is pressed together and it sinks under that relentless pressure of the load, you lose the protective layer.
And then the wood is pressing right on the animal.
The unforgiving wooden frame presses directly onto the camel's back. It generates severe chafing, open wounds, abscesses. I mean, that's an incapacitating injury. And a camel that can't move means the entire caravan stops.
Yeah.
Potentially for days or even weeks.
And the second risk goes back to the cords themselves.
Yes. If the load shifts even slightly, or if the cords are poor quality or tied improperly, they can start to move. And instead of distributing the weight, they start cutting into the animal's skin.
Wow.
The source really stresses that the margin for error here is razor thin. A bad knot or a poorly sized frame is the difference between a successful week of travel and an animal becoming totally lame. It could cost the expedition weeks of time and crucial supplies.
So if we zoom out from the engineering here, what does this intense fragility demand from the travelers? The source makes this direct connection between being careful with the saddle and, well, human survival.
It does. The source emphasizes that being extremely careful in arranging these saddles and loads is essential. It spares the camel no end of trouble. And, critically for the traveler, it's the key to having plentiful food.
Right.
The efficiency of the transport system directly determines how many resources will survive the journey and in what condition. If the camel fails, the food fails, and the expedition starves.
If that failure margin is so thin, that means maintenance has to be just relentless. How much time did these travelers actually spend just keeping this fragile system running?
You know, we might assume that when they stopped for rest, they were just sleeping or eating, recovering from the heat.
Yeah.
But the reality is brutal. The source notes that during the march, after the heat and burden of the day, travelers had to dedicate hours of their very limited rest time to maintenance. Stitching, patching, replacing worn cordage, reinforcing the frame ties.
Why not just wait until they got to a town? Or an oasis with proper repair shops? Why this constant daily triage?
Because the damage accumulates so fast.
Yeah.
A tiny bit of chafing today becomes a gaping wound tomorrow. A small section of cord that's starting to fray can snap the next day, and the whole load shifts catastrophically.
These are immediate pressures.
Immediate environmental pressures.
Yeah.
The high heat, the friction from desert grit, the constant movement. It meant the logistical foundation was just decaying in real time. It was this relentless cycle. You move, then you immediately do focused repair just to make sure you can move again tomorrow. It really highlights how precious and fragile the whole logistics chain was.
That makes the acquisition phase seem even more critical. You can't start a journey with bad equipment if you know you're going to be constantly fixing it. The source details this specific transaction where they bought 6 camels in Malta. It gives us a great window into the scale of all this.
It really does. And let's talk about the cost, because that tells you so much about the value of this asset. The average price for these animals was 50 Maria Theresa dollars, or about 200 marks each.
Okay, those historical currencies are a bit abstract for us now. If we try to contextualize that value, What does 200 marks for one camel really represent?
It means this was not cheap transport. This was a high-value capital asset. In that historical context, 200 marks was an astronomical sum, far more than most laborers would earn in a year.
Wow.
It was like investing a fortune. And it meant that the stakes for failure were incredibly high.
Wow.
If a camel became lame because of a poor saddle fitting, you weren't just losing transportation, you were losing an asset worth more than your average yearly income.
That high financial risk immediately explains why expertise was so important. You couldn't just have a novice haggling for the cheapest deal.
Absolutely not. The purchase was supervised by this great expert named Mohammed El-Katrouni. The source specifically credits him with ensuring the camels were adequate and reasonably foreseen in quality.
I like that phrase.
You couldn't skimp on expertise at the procurement stage, because a flaw in the animal's build or its condition could doom the expedition before it even started. It would render that massive investment totally useless.
So if we connect this back to the bigger picture, it shows that Mohammed El-Katrouni's foresight in picking a structurally sound animal was just as important as the engineer who designed the wood and saddle frame. It's all integrated expertise. Once they had the camels, what specialized supplies did he need to buy to make the whole system work? We're talking cords and containers, but not just any kind, right?
Right. Beyond the animals and the frames, the connective tissue was essential. For that load distribution we were talking about, they needed very specific cords, woven meticulously from camel wool.
Camel wool.
Yeah, this wasn't just grabbing any old rope. They needed a material that was strong enough to bear the weight, but also soft enough with the right amount of give to keep the cords from sawing into the animals or the padding.
And the containers are equally fascinating. They had to protect resources in this incredibly hostile, climate-intense heat. Zero humidity. The source names Gurara and Gerba. Are these different things or just different sizes?
They fulfilled distinct critical roles, which just speaks to how meticulous the provisioning had to be. The Gerba were the water skins, absolutely crucial.
Okay, for hydration.
And the Gurara were typically larger goat skin bags. These were used specifically for dry provisions, grains, dried meat, dates.
So one for water, one for calories, both goat skin. But the source makes a very specific point about how they were made.
Yes, and this is another great example of why material science was so essential. These weren't tanned leather. They were waterproof goat skin bags that still had the hair on the outside, and they were specially dressed on the inside.
Why keep the hair on?
For insulation. That hair provided an extra layer against the blazing desert heat, which helped keep the contents, especially water cooler, and it minimized evaporation.
And the quality of these containers wasn't generic. The source notes that the best ones, the unsurpassed quality bags, came from the distant House estates.
That detail is such a crucial nugget of information. It tells us that these travelers, preparing in Malta or wherever, they were relying on this massive long-distance trade network just to get reliable gear.
Right.
They knew that a local, lower-quality bag was a direct risk to their provisions. Sourcing the best possible Gurara meant their grains stayed dry and fresh, avoiding spoilage that could starve the entire expedition. They were prioritizing known, high-quality suppliers from far away for their most critical materials.
And beyond the logistics gear, they also had to provide for basic life on the road. What did the rest of the supply list look like? I'm guessing everything had to be durable and multi-purpose.
It's a very functional pared-down list. Copper cauldrons for cooking, a sturdy tripod to hang them over the fire, and then a broad, flat piece of tin copper.
A flat piece of copper.
Yeah, and that piece served double duty. It was used as a minimal cooking surface and also as their main eating utensil. Every single item had to be robust enough to survive months of daily packing, unpacking, heat, and grit.
So if we bring all these details together, what's the single biggest lesson this deep dive offers us about historical efficiency and survival?
I think the key takeaway is that historical efficiency wasn't about speed or about brute force. It was about the rigorous application of meticulous planning and deep applied expertise. From calculating the exact angle and width of that wooden saddle brace to sourcing specific goatskin bags from faraway states. Every single detail was a matter of life or death. The source material really reinforces the high value placed on knowledge and the foresight of experts like Mohammed El-Katrouni. They were, the original logistics managers.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? We often look at simple tools from history, like a saddle, and we just dismiss them as basic concepts. But in the context of survival and trade and sustaining life across impossible distances, the simple camel saddle becomes this incredibly advanced piece of engineering.
It really does.
The source material forces you to appreciate that hidden complexity. A bad stitch, a poor quality cord, a frame that was just 2 millimeters too wide. It could literally doom the entire journey and prevent you from securing plentiful food.
The entire operational success, all the way down to the freshness of the water and the integrity of the dry goods, it all relied completely on the quality and arrangement of that load on that saddle.
Which raises an important question for you to explore on your own. We live in a world of complex infrastructure, so think about your own modern logistical setup. What seemingly simple piece of necessary infrastructure or equipment are you relying on? Something foundational that you never think about, that if it fails, it immediately and completely impacts your ability to sustain yourself. Is it the durability of the pipes bringing clean water to your home, the reliability of the grid that keeps your refrigeration running, or the structural integrity of the bridge that delivers your supplies? The historical reality of the camel saddle reminds us that sometimes the simple, overlooked foundational things are, in fact, the most critical, advanced engineering marvels we rely on.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the source materials you share with us, the notes, the articles, the research, and really try to build a concise, actionable understanding of a complex topic.
And today we are plunging into a really fascinating set of historical excerpts. These aren't, grand adventure stories. They're more like the logistical memos, sometimes painfully detailed about preparing for an expedition in the 19th century.
Specifically through Tripoli and Fezzan.
Exactly.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We want to get a quick, solid grasp of the sheer effort involved. We're talking about the gear, the people you had to hire, and I think most importantly, the mindset you needed just to set off into the deep desert back then.
It's a great shortcut to understanding what it took just to get out the door.
Right.
And what's so striking as you read these is that the success of the whole thing really hinged on this incredible granular level of detail. It wasn't about the big swashbuckling stuff yet.
Yeah.
It was about navigating the completely mundane, multi-purpose items and the really complex social negotiations that had to happen before you could even take that first step.
Okay, let's unpack that, because this is a perfect contrast between, say, planning on paper and actual survival. So let's start with the literal tools of the trade.
Yeah, the gear. If you're going into an environment like that, every single thing you carry has to justify its weight in space, like 10 times over. The sources highlight one piece of equipment that just perfectly illustrates this.
The single leather vessel.
The single crucial leather vessel. They don't just say a bucket. They go into its intense multifunctionality. The source calls it a delu.
And it had to serve, 3 totally distinct functions?
3 often conflicting functions.
Yeah,
It's
sure.
the ultimate example of forced resourcefulness. So job 1, the most vital, was watering the camels. That needs a big, tough container.
Okay, makes sense.
Job 2 was cleaning the vessel itself. You have to wash it out, especially in a sandy environment, to avoid contamination.
And job 3.
It was also your washing machine. It's what you use for your personal laundry.
Wow. I mean, that sounds incredibly unhygienic to us now.
Totally. But it just speaks to this profound scarcity. You didn't have the luxury of separate tubs for drinking water, for cleaning, for laundry. You had this one delu, and you had to manage it all.
And that philosophy that every piece of gear has to be multi-purpose, that's really what separated the experienced travelers from the newcomers, right? The Europeans.
Exactly. The sources bring that contrast to light immediately, because it wasn't just the physical hardship that caught the Europeans off guard.
It was a lack of preparedness for the absolute essentials.
Yes. The sources specifically call out that European travelers would show up without basic things that any local guide would know were critical.
Like what?
Simple things like proper camel bridles.
Seriously?
Yeah. I mean, imagine planning a huge road trip today. You've got the car, you've got the fuel, but you forgot the steering wheel.
It's that big of an oversight.
It's immense. It just shows that relying on book knowledge alone was totally insufficient. You needed guidance that was rooted in daily lived experience.
Which is such a strong parallel for you, the listener, trying to navigate today's world of information. You can have the whole blueprint, this massive data set, but if you miss that one critical dependency,
camel bridle.
the camel bridle, the whole thing just grinds to a halt.
And this need for local expertise led directly to how they provisioned the trip. The documents show that the travel party didn't just rely on their own plans.
Right. They drew up their list after the first day.
After their first day of assessment, and only after talking everything through with a local expert they call Herr Rossi.
So success wasn't about being some lone genius. It was about recognizing the limits of your own knowledge and actually trusting local guidance. You can't plan a trip to Fezzan from an armchair in London.
Absolutely. The ability to just swallow your pride and defer to local knowledge is itself a critical logistical skill. So once that gear list was settled and Rossi approved the provisions, the focus shifted from objects to the most complex resource of all,
The human element.
human element.
So we're moving from the tools to the people who make the journey possible. The sources say the camels were already bought, they were grazing nearby, so now it's about hiring the crew.
And the first hire they detail is a man named Ali El-Fazani. He's also known as Abu Bekr. He's a young man from Fezzan, and he was hired purely on the recommendation from a trusted elder, the old Katruni.
So it's all about that chain of trust.
That's the currency here. But the description of Ali is where things get interesting. The source gives this incredibly frank and frankly pretty negative first impression of him.
It describes him as looking like a stray vagabond.
A stray vagabond. And it says he was nervous, he looked ill, he had this whitish skin rash, which they chalked up to the sea air affecting him.
So this raises a huge question about how you vet people, right? You're hiring a guide for a life or death journey, and the guy looks miserable, sick, and nervous.
It should have been a massive red flag.
Absolutely.
Look-
But they trusted the recommendation from the Katruni implicitly, and that tells you something huge about that economy.
That skill and trustworthiness, which were validated by a personal relationship, were way more important than what you look like or even your current health.
The personal vouching was more valuable than a resume.
Exactly. The assumption has to be that despite his condition, Ali El-Fazani had this proven, intimate knowledge of the roots. His temporary illness was a solvable problem. A lack of skill or trust was not.
And the other two men they hired, this seems to confirm that focus on social standing.
It does. They hired two other men, Saad and a second Ali, and they were described as married freedmen of a respected citizen in the town.
So again, they're not transient. They have roots, a reputation in the community.
Right, which implies dependability. And Saad was from Mandara, which is way south of Bornu. That means he'd have invaluable knowledge of the southern trade routes.
And the second Ali gets another one of those really specific physical descriptions.
Yes. Dark-skinned, short, completely beardless, large, flattened nose, large mouth, with very white teeth. It's just very meticulous observation, maybe for their field notes.
But the most telling detail about the first Ali, the vagabond, wasn't his rash. It was what he was wearing.
Which brings us right back to the gear.
Exactly. The source says he was immediately outfitted with a serviceable, dark, striped, thick woolen garment from the supply of Gerhard Rolfs.
The famous German explorer. And this is a perfect snapshot of logistics overriding everything else. They take this guy who looks like a wreck.
And they immediately wrap him in high-quality, specialized imported gear.
The description of the garment is so specific. Wide, fastened in front, knee-length, with a big opening for the head, and crucially, a hood.
And the source emphasizes how important that hood was for keeping your head warm against the cold desert nights. It was a piece of survival equipment.
So even if Ali looked ragged, the gear was non-negotiable. It shows this blending of local trust with, for the time, modern provisions. They trusted the man, but they didn't trust him to stay warm in his own clothes.
Okay, so we've got the multifunctional gear. We've got the essential, if nervous-looking, human element hired and equipped. That brings us to our third segment, provisions, and the final, surprisingly political, steps.
Right. So the final logistical stages. First, they handled the diplomatic necessities.
Oh.
The presents for the king were secured. That's a political box checked.
Then they finalized the food, again talking with Herr Rossi.
And they locked down the staples, ship's biscuit, which was called bugsumat, rice, or ruse, and a specific coarse-grained couscous called mahamis.
These are smart choices. Dry, calorie-dense, portable.
Exactly. And the source even provides a footnote to explain mahamis.
Which is helpful. Defines it as a favorite dish in Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. Small balls of wheaten flour. So they're not trying to drag European food into the desert. They're using efficient, local staples.
They were maximizing local nutritional wisdom. So they have the gear, the crew, the food, the diplomatic gifts. They are technically ready to go, but the very last step involved a series of social duties that, according to the source, caused more friction than the entire provisioning process.
This is where it shifts from difficult to just absurd. The final step was these mandated paid visits to distinguished Europeans and local government officials.
It sounds bureaucratic, right? Paying respects, getting final papers. But the source says the fulfillment of these duties had great difficulties.
And it's so specific about why. It wasn't the heat or some complex permit. It was, and I'm quoting here, ludicrous but deep-seated social distinctions that the Europeans themselves had introduced.
This is such a profound insight. The very people who were supposedly there to facilitate exploration had imposed these rigid, arbitrary social hierarchies on the whole process.
So getting your final clearance became a nightmare, not because of local issues, but because the Europeans were obsessed with protocols of rank, who visits whom, who's more important.
The travelers had to battle drawing room politics, ego, and posturing just to get permission to enter the desert, the most politically neutral landscape imaginable.
What a clash of realities.
It's incredible. The biggest logistical hurdle wasn't the physical world they were about to enter, but the petty, fragile social world they were trying to leave behind.
So the true cost of setting off wasn't just money or energy. It was the time and diplomatic effort spent battling these egos just to get the final stamp of approval.
The technical readiness was there. Camels, couscous, crew all set. But the launch button was controlled by this complex social matrix that cared more about appearances than the actual expedition.
So after all that, what does this deep dive really mean? What are the key pillars of preparedness we can distill from these sources for you?
I think there are three. First, the absolute demand for precise multifunctional gear. That one leather Delu doing 3 jobs because of scarcity.
Second, the total necessity of relying on local expertise and trust, validated through social connections. You hire the nervous-looking guy with a rash because the right person vouched for him, and his knowledge is more important than his appearance.
And third, the biggest point of friction wasn't a lack of supplies, but the exhausting need to navigate these complex, arbitrary social distinctions, those ludicrous hierarchies, just to get clearance.
The sources really make a compelling case that the journey's success hinged less on having the right stuff in your tent and more on having the social intelligence to overcome the friction required to even get started.
Absolutely. The ability to manage that human and political landscape was the ultimate survival skill.
Fascinating. So let's leave you with a final thought to explore on your own. Based on this historical deep dive, think about how much of the success of any big project today, launching a product, starting research, still hinges less on the technical prep, which we tend to overplan.
And more on managing those deep-seated social distinctions between all the necessary actors, the stakeholders, the gatekeepers.
It really seems like the human element, with all its political complexity, is still the perennial barrier to progress, no matter the century or the continent.
Indeed. Something to mull over until our next deep dive.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the source materials you share with us, the notes, the articles, the research, and really try to build a concise, actionable understanding of a complex topic.
And today we are plunging into a really fascinating set of historical excerpts. These aren't, grand adventure stories. They're more like the logistical memos, sometimes painfully detailed about preparing for an expedition in the 19th century.
Specifically through Tripoli and Fezzan.
Exactly.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We want to get a quick, solid grasp of the sheer effort involved. We're talking about the gear, the people you had to hire, and I think most importantly, the mindset you needed just to set off into the deep desert back then.
It's a great shortcut to understanding what it took just to get out the door.
Right.
And what's so striking as you read these is that the success of the whole thing really hinged on this incredible granular level of detail. It wasn't about the big swashbuckling stuff yet.
Yeah.
It was about navigating the completely mundane, multi-purpose items and the really complex social negotiations that had to happen before you could even take that first step.
Okay, let's unpack that, because this is a perfect contrast between, say, planning on paper and actual survival. So let's start with the literal tools of the trade.
Yeah, the gear. If you're going into an environment like that, every single thing you carry has to justify its weight in space, like 10 times over. The sources highlight one piece of equipment that just perfectly illustrates this.
The single leather vessel.
The single crucial leather vessel. They don't just say a bucket. They go into its intense multifunctionality. The source calls it a delu.
And it had to serve, 3 totally distinct functions?
3 often conflicting functions.
Yeah,
It's
sure.
the ultimate example of forced resourcefulness. So job 1, the most vital, was watering the camels. That needs a big, tough container.
Okay, makes sense.
Job 2 was cleaning the vessel itself. You have to wash it out, especially in a sandy environment, to avoid contamination.
And job 3.
It was also your washing machine. It's what you use for your personal laundry.
Wow. I mean, that sounds incredibly unhygienic to us now.
Totally. But it just speaks to this profound scarcity. You didn't have the luxury of separate tubs for drinking water, for cleaning, for laundry. You had this one delu, and you had to manage it all.
And that philosophy that every piece of gear has to be multi-purpose, that's really what separated the experienced travelers from the newcomers, right? The Europeans.
Exactly. The sources bring that contrast to light immediately, because it wasn't just the physical hardship that caught the Europeans off guard.
It was a lack of preparedness for the absolute essentials.
Yes. The sources specifically call out that European travelers would show up without basic things that any local guide would know were critical.
Like what?
Simple things like proper camel bridles.
Seriously?
Yeah. I mean, imagine planning a huge road trip today. You've got the car, you've got the fuel, but you forgot the steering wheel.
It's that big of an oversight.
It's immense. It just shows that relying on book knowledge alone was totally insufficient. You needed guidance that was rooted in daily lived experience.
Which is such a strong parallel for you, the listener, trying to navigate today's world of information. You can have the whole blueprint, this massive data set, but if you miss that one critical dependency,
Well, camel bridle.
the camel bridle, the whole thing just grinds to a halt.
And this need for local expertise led directly to how they provisioned the trip. The documents show that the travel party didn't just rely on their own plans.
Right. They drew up their list after the first day.
After their first day of assessment, and only after talking everything through with a local expert they call Herr Rossi.
So success wasn't about being some lone genius. It was about recognizing the limits of your own knowledge and actually trusting local guidance. You can't plan a trip to Fezzan from an armchair in London.
Absolutely. The ability to just swallow your pride and defer to local knowledge is itself a critical logistical skill. So once that gear list was settled and Rossi approved the provisions, the focus shifted from objects to the most complex resource of all,
The human element.
human element.
So we're moving from the tools to the people who make the journey possible. The sources say the camels were already bought, they were grazing nearby, so now it's about hiring the crew.
And the first hire they detail is a man named Ali El-Fazani. He's also known as Abu Bakr. He's a young man from Fezzan, and he was hired purely on a recommendation from a trusted elder, the old Katruni.
So it's all about that chain of trust.
That's the currency here. But the description of Ali is where things get interesting. The source gives this incredibly frank and frankly pretty negative first impression of him.
It describes him as looking like a stray vagabond.
A stray vagabond. And it says he was nervous, he looked ill, he had this whitish skin rash, which they chalked up to the sea air affecting him.
So this raises a huge question about how you vet people, right? You're hiring a guide for a life or death journey, and the guy looks miserable, sick, and nervous.
It should have been a massive red flag.
Absolutely. But they trusted the recommendation from the Katruni implicitly. And that tells you something huge about that economy.
That skill and trustworthiness, which were validated by a personal relationship, were way more important than what you look like or even your current health.
The personal vouching was more valuable than a resume.
Exactly. The assumption has to be that despite his condition, Ali El-Fazani had this proven, intimate knowledge of the routes. His temporary illness was a solvable problem. A lack of skill or trust was not.
And the other two men they hired, this seems to confirm that focus on social standing.
It does. They hired two other men, Saad and a second Ali, and they were described as married freedmen of a respected citizen in the town.
So again, they're not transient. They have roots, a reputation in the community.
Right, which implies dependability. And Saad was from Mandara, which is way south of Bornu. That means he'd have invaluable knowledge of the southern trade routes.
And the second Ali gets another one of those really specific physical descriptions.
Yes. Dark-skinned, short, completely beardless, large, flattened nose, large mouth, with very white teeth. It's just very meticulous observation, maybe for their field notes.
But the most telling detail about the first Ali, the vagabond, wasn't his rash. It was what he was wearing.
Which brings us right back to the gear.
Exactly. The source says he was immediately outfitted with a serviceable, dark, striped, thick woolen garment from the supply of Gerhard Rolfs.
The famous German explorer. And this is a perfect snapshot of logistics overriding everything else. They take this guy who looks like a wreck.
And they immediately wrap him in high-quality, specialized imported gear.
The description of the garment is so specific. Wide, fastened in front, knee-length, with a big opening for the head, and crucially, a hood.
And the source emphasizes how important that hood was for keeping your head warm against the cold desert nights. It was a piece of survival equipment.
So even if Ali looked ragged, the gear was non-negotiable. It shows this blending of local trust with, for the time, modern provisions. They trusted the man, but they didn't trust him to stay warm in his own clothes.
Okay, so we've got the multifunctional gear. We've got the essential, if nervous-looking, human element hired and equipped. That brings us to our third segment, provisions, and the final, surprisingly political, steps.
Right. So the final logistical stages. First, they handled the diplomatic necessities.
Oh.
The presents for the king were secured. That's a political box checked.
Then they finalized the food, again talking with Heirossi.
And they locked down the staples, ship's biscuit, which was called bugsuma, rice or ruse, and a specific coarse-grained couscous called mohames.
These are smart choices. Dry, calorie-dense, portable.
Exactly. And the source even provides a footnote to explain mohames.
Which is helpful. It defines it as a favorite dish in Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. Small balls of wheaten flour. So they're not trying to drag European food into the desert. They're using efficient, local staples.
They were maximizing local nutritional wisdom. So they have the gear, the crew, the food, the diplomatic gifts. They are technically ready to go. But the very last step involved a series of social duties that, according to the source, caused more friction than the entire provisioning process.
This is where it shifts from difficult to just absurd. The final step was these mandated paid visits to distinguished Europeans and local government officials.
It sounds bureaucratic, right? Paying respects, getting final papers. But the source says the fulfillment of these duties had great difficulties.
And it's so specific about why. It wasn't the heat or some complex permit. It was, and I'm quoting here, ludicrous but deep-seated social distinctions that the Europeans themselves had introduced.
This is such a profound insight. The very people who were supposedly there to facilitate exploration had imposed these rigid, arbitrary social hierarchies on the whole process.
So getting your final clearance became a nightmare, not because of local issues, but because the Europeans were obsessed with protocols of rank, who visits whom, who's more important.
The travelers had to battle drawing room politics, ego, and posturing just to get permission to enter the desert, the most politically neutral landscape imaginable.
What a clash of realities.
It's incredible. The biggest logistical hurdle wasn't the physical world they were about to enter, but the petty, fragile social world they were trying to leave behind.
So the true cost of setting off wasn't just money or energy. It was the time and diplomatic effort spent battling these egos just to get the final stamp of approval.
The technical readiness was there. Camels, couscous, crew all set. But the launch button was controlled by this complex social matrix that cared more about appearances than the actual expedition.
So after all that, what does this deep dive really mean? What are the key pillars of preparedness we can distill from these sources for you?
I think there are three. First, the absolute demand for precise multifunctional gear. That one leather Delu doing 3 jobs because of scarcity.
Second, the total necessity of relying on local expertise and trust, validated through social connections. You hire the nervous-looking guy with the rash because the right person vouched for him, and his knowledge is more important than his appearance.
And third, the biggest point of friction wasn't a lack of supplies, but the exhausting need to navigate these complex, arbitrary social distinctions, those ludicrous hierarchies, just to get clearance.
The sources really make a compelling case that the journey's success hinged less on having the right stuff in your tent and more on having the social intelligence to overcome the friction required to even get started.
Absolutely. The ability to manage that human and political landscape was the ultimate survival skill.
Fascinating. So let's leave you with a final thought to explore on your own. Based on this historical deep dive, think about how much of the success of any big project today, launching a product, starting research, still hinges less on the technical prep, which we tend to overplan.
And more on managing those deep-seated social distinctions between all the necessary actors, the stakeholders, the gatekeepers.
It really seems like the human element, with all its political complexity, is still the perennial barrier to progress, no matter the century or the continent.
Indeed. Something to mull over until our next deep dive.
We're embarking on a deep dive today into a really specific, fascinating corner of 19th century history. We're looking at the frontier of European contact in North Africa. Specifically, the trade routes that connect Tripoli, the Fezzan Desert, and the Kingdom of Bornu.
Right, this critical corridor.
Exactly. And the sources you've given us, they don't really paint a picture of, grand armies or sweeping government policy.
No, not at all. It's much more granular.
It's about individuals, the people on the ground who really made the machine run. So our mission today is to explore this messy, contradictory world of early diplomacy through two men.
Two very different men.
Very different, both operating under the British flag. We have G.B. Gagliuffi, the savvy Italian merchant who becomes this long-serving consul.
And then Frederick Warrington.
The unassuming, sort of hyper-specialized vice consul. A completely different profile.
And you have to remember, these figures weren't your typical diplomats in, say, Paris or Vienna. They were really operating on the margins. They were commercial agents, political reps, and, they were also the gatekeepers for major European explorers.
So when someone like Nachtigal shows up.
Exactly. When explorers like Barth or Nachtigal reach these incredibly remote outposts, these are the men who give them the vital intelligence they need to survive, let alone succeed. And the context here, it's just so high stakes. The relationship between these Europeans and the local traders and rulers, it was never simple.
I can't imagine it was.
It was often strained, full of conflicting goals, but it was always defined by this deep mutual reliance. You couldn't get anything done without the other.
So if you're a European power, you need them for everything. Trade, information.
Safe passage, even. You had to rely entirely on the local intelligence and the relationships that these men had cultivated over years.
So, okay, that brings us to our central question for you, the listener. In this volatile world of commerce and early diplomacy, how did two men with such wildly different approaches?
The pragmatist and the scholar.
Right. The calculated pragmatist and the culturally absorbed scholar. How did they both manage to navigate and really shape European involvement in this region? Let's start with the one who spent the most time shaping his identity. G.B. Gagliuffi.
A fascinating character study.
He really is. He's a study in calculated adaptation. He starts out as an Italian trader. He's lived in Tripoli for years, so he's mastered the commercial landscape.
And it was more than that. The sources are clear. He had this very close relationship with the local power structures.
Right, with the Awlad Suleiman chief Abd el-Jalil.
He was his agent and his personal friend, and that connection is absolutely key. It wasn't just about selling goods for him.
It was political protection.
A leverage.
Exactly. But I'd say his tactical genius, it really emerges in 1849. He makes this incredibly strategic choice to become a naturalized British subject.
And right after that.
Immediately. He secures the position of British vice consul in Merzouk. He holds that post for 8 years. This move, it just clearly signals that he saw the British flag as a tool. A powerful commercial and political tool. The best one available for advancing his interests at that time.
Absolutely.
And it's fascinating that the British were willing to give him that status. So what was the official mission of this consulate he established?
Well, according to sources like Bowen and Richardson, the primary goal was extremely ambitious for that context.
Which was?
To discourage the slave trade, and where that just wasn't possible, to at least ensure much better treatment of the enslaved servants on those trade routes.
Okay, so that's a very high-minded moral objective.
Extremely. And that is where you get this deep contradiction. You have this official diplomatic mission, but the man implementing it, he openly described himself not as a diplomat, but as a merchant, and a Levantine merchant to boot.
A Levantine merchant to boot.
Yes. He wasn't hiding his primary identity.
So is this a conflict of interest he managed to sort of sidestep? The sources seem to say no.
Not at all. While he's holding the British title, he is absolutely juggling his official duties with his own commercial transactions.
It was impossible to separate the two.
Impossible. The consulate gave him protection, status, access, all of which directly benefited his private trade.
And that overlap, it seems it made some of his British colleagues a bit skeptical.
To say the least. While explorers like Nachtigal relied on him heavily and spoke very highly of his knowledge, we have this incredible observation from his colleague, Richardson.
What did he say?
Richardson noted that Gagliuffi's conduct just proved that Levantines are and will be Levantines to the end of time.
Wow. Okay, I want to pause on that quote.
Right.
Because on the surface, it just reads like a critique of his ethics, right? That he was too commercial for a diplomatic post.
That's the simple reading, yes.
But if we dig a little deeper, doesn't that statement also reveal a kind of inherent cultural bias from some of these British officials?
Absolutely. That's the necessary nuance.
This idea that a proper vice consul has to shed his commercial background entirely. A sort of cultural hierarchy that puts the Levantine merchant below the official British bureaucrat.
That's it. It shows you how power and perception operated. For Richardson, Gagliuffi's pragmatism was a flaw. It was an inability to maintain the purity of the diplomatic mission.
But for Gagliuffi,
For Gagliuffi, that pragmatism, that commercial focus, that was precisely what allowed him to survive and operate effectively in the Fezzan. He knew that pure idealism wouldn't get a caravan through the desert.
only long-standing, profitable relationships would.
Exactly.
And the man's staying power is just.
Yeah.
It's incredible. He steps down from the British role in 1857. He even refuses to come back after 1860, citing his age. He was 65.
A perfectly reasonable time to retire from that kind of work.
A very reasonable time.
Eh.
But that wasn't the end. He goes on to become the Belgian consul in Tripoli.
His engagement with the region just never waned, and the detail that just anchors his relentless character for me, it's from the late 1880s. The sources describe him as being 88 years old,
88.
still strong, and actively preparing for a demanding Kuka expedition across the desert. He embodies this lifelong, almost obsessive engagement with the region.
88. Still plotting trans-Saharan journeys. It sets the scene so beautifully because that relentless, commercially savvy Gagliuffi is the perfect contrast to the man who temporarily replaced him,
Frederick Warrington.
Frederick Warrington. Gagliuffi was the merchant who learned diplomacy. Warrington seems to be the scholar who is reluctantly pressed into service.
That's the key difference. Warrington fills in as vice consul in Murzuk for about a year in 1856, and where Gagliuffi's reputation was built on business acumen and leverage.
Warrington's was built on his personality and his specialized knowledge.
Precisely. He's described in the sources with this profound respect as the most amiable and agreeable and unassuming man in the world.
That unassuming description, though, it hides a truly extraordinary set of skills. Skills the British system needed, but maybe didn't value highly enough.
Well, he wasn't just generally knowledgeable. He was considered an authority on everything related to the Arab character, colloquial Arabic, and the customs of Fezzan and the Sudan.
And then there's the detail that just elevates him completely.
He also spoke the language of Bornu.
The language of Bornu. I mean, think about the strategic importance of that.
It's massive. Bornu was the major power at the end of the line, the central destination for these expeditions. By speaking the language, Warrington could bypass layers of interpreters who might have their own agendas.
So he gets direct, unfiltered access to local courts, to political machinations.
Exactly.
That level of fluency wasn't just a party trick. It was mission-critical intelligence. It suggests he was.
Yeah.
He was more ethnographer than bureaucrat.
The sources confirm this. They note he was indeed completely absorbed in African affairs.
Completely absorbed.
Yet, and here's the fascinating part, despite this profound cultural depth, the sources also note that his diplomatic role was seen as employing him only in a very humble capacity.
A humble capacity. Which raises that historical question. Why was this deep, specialized understanding of the local culture relegated to a subordinate rank?
While the operational logistics, the commercial connections of a Gagliuffi, that's what garnered the formal titles. It's a real puzzle.
It seems like the establishment only recognized the value of his knowledge when they really needed it, but they didn't integrate it into the formal power structure.
And we see his influence in action. When the explorer Nachtigal passed through Murzuk in 1850, it was Warrington who received him. He was the essential human connector, the translator of both language and custom.
A cultural bridge.
A successful one, precisely because of his excellent rapport with the local population. That fluency and respect led to him being described as perhaps the most amiable possible specimen of an Arabo-African European.
An Arabo-African European, that's not a description you just hand out.
No, it implies he had genuinely synthesized his European identity with the environment he was in.
Okay, let's unpack this and really connect these two. We have Gagliuffi, the long-term, commercially driven powerhouse who adapts his identity, his flag, purely for leverage and survival. He builds infrastructure.
The hard-won connections.
And then we have Warrington, the short-term expert linguist whose authority was purely intellectual and cultural, stemming from deep knowledge and respect, but operating in that humble capacity.
The contrast shows us the two critical components you needed for any European activity in that environment. Gagliuffi provided the indispensable logistical framework, the commercial continuity, the operational muscle.
But
Warrington provided the vital layer of accurate understanding and intelligence, the mind.
in the place like the 19th century Sahara, I guess official titles meant very little if you couldn't actually read the political environment or navigate the local customs.
They meant almost nothing. The sources really highlight that success required this kind of hybridity. It wasn't Gagliuffi or Warrington that made it work. It was the whole system benefiting from having both the ruthless pragmatist and the quiet, deeply informed expert.
So for you, the learner, if you're trying to become well-informed about a complex new landscape, these sources offer a profound listen. Being truly effective requires both. It requires the detailed, pragmatic, maybe even ruthless commercial insight of a Gagliuffi, the person who knows how the machine works, who pays for the oil, and the deep cultural respect and intellectual absorption of Warrington, the person who knows how to read the room, who knows what the machine is actually saying.
And that leads us to a final thought. Consider that mismatch in the system that valued Warrington's incredible cultural insight only minimally on the diplomatic ladder.
Right.
For someone to be described as completely absorbed in the cultures they study, showing this profound, valuable expertise, yet at the same time to be constrained to a very humble capacity.
It makes you question what that deep knowledge is truly worth to an organization, to a state.
Especially when it doesn't come wrapped in formal administrative power.
That's a powerful point. And to go back to Gagliuffi, a man who just refused to stop, 88 years old, preparing for another expedition. What personal drive, what level of engagement motivated these figures to dedicate their entire lives to this incredibly challenging world, to keep pushing those diplomatic and trade efforts right until the very end? Something for you to mull over as you consider what it means to truly commit to knowing a complex world. If you've ever watched a major development project or, a shiny new policy just sputter out and fail,
Yeah.
not because the money wasn't there, but because the people weren't ready, then you'll understand what we're getting into today. We have this remarkable set of sources about 19th century modernization in North Africa. We're talking specifically about Tripoli, Fezzan, and Tunisia. And the analysis in them is deeply cynical. So our mission in this deep dive is to uncover why. Why did so many of these reforms, a lot of them initiated under pressure from, or just imitation of, European powers, why did they just end up as superficial window dressing?
Right.
And lead to, staggering corruption and stagnation instead of the progress that was promised? We want to get past the what and really dig into the structural why.
And what's so fascinating, what really jumps out from these sources is how precisely they identify this core tension. They argue that the leaders, they adopted the physical things of modern civilization.
Artifacts.
Exactly. The artifacts.
Yeah.
The gaslighting, the telegraphs, the European-style courts. But they did it without building the necessary social foundations. It's like they imported the roof before they even poured the foundation.
That's a great way to put it.
They highlight this massive difference between just, implementing visible infrastructure and actually creating the culture, the administrative honesty, the education you need for what they call true civilizing work. So the central critique is structural. I mean, what good is a railway if the entire administrative culture rewards incompetence and actively discourages critical thought?
So the reforms were basically doomed from the start.
That's the argument. They didn't come from the needs of the people. They came from this urge to imitate European fashion.
Okay, so let's unpack that idea of imitation. Let's look at what the sources call the illusion of modernization in places like Tripoli and Fezzan, because these weren't small projects. They were building huge symbols of progress.
Huge symbols, yeah.
We're talking a modern aqueduct, gas lighting in the cities, a telegraph line, and even plans for a railway.
Yeah.
But the motivations, this is the part that's just astounding. The motivations the sources cite are so superficial.
It's almost comical.
It is. The drive to modernize wasn't about industrial strategy or public health. It was often rooted in, and the source is very sarcastic here, feeble knowledge of French, or this desire to keep up with Paris fashions.
An irresistible urge for European decoration, I think is the quote.
That's it. It was about seeming modern, not being modern.
And that aesthetic impulse, that's the core of the problem. These projects were a performance for a European audience and, self-aggrandizement for the local rulers. And if you follow the consequences of these projects not arising from the consciousness and needs of the people, well, the failure is immediate.
And visible.
And very visible. The sources paint this stark picture of these grand creations just collecting dust. They're built, admired for a second, and then just abandoned. There's no local need to maintain them.
And the debt. I mean, you have to assume the debt from these vanity projects was enormous. The sources implied this wasn't just wasteful, it was actively destabilizing.
Oh, absolutely. While the source focuses more on the moral and intellectual failure, the financial disaster is clear. These huge expenditures, which had no real economic function, they just drained the state's money. And their only real use, according to the sources, was getting praise in European newspapers.
So the rulers could see themselves called great reformers.
Exactly. But back home, everyone knew the truth. It was just clumsy imitation, inherently ephemeral, costly, and useless.
So if importing physical things, aqueducts, gaslights, was failing because these cosmetic motives, what happened when they tried to import something way more complex, like an entire administrative and legal framework? Let's transition to the case study of Tunisia.
Right. This is where it gets even worse.
The sources detail massive spending here too, but for operational power, a military.
A state military machine, yeah.
A large frigate, dispatch boats, troop ships, hundreds of cannon. And at the same time, this huge judicial reform, the creation of law courts, based meticulously on the European model.
Importing justice itself.
Exactly.
Yep.
On the surface, that sounds like a real attempt at state building.
It sounds like it, yes. But this is the critical turn in the source material. The author moves from condemning superficial infrastructure to condemning this fundamental administrative failure. They argue that importing these ready-made systems without the right internal culture, the ethical plumbing, it was a disaster.
How so?
Well, the military hardware was there, but the discipline, the operational capability, it was lacking. And the judicial reform, oh, that was even worse.
Worse how?
The imported court model, instead of protecting justice, it undermined the prosperity of the country.
Undermined it.
Yes, because it just gave high officials new, bigger, more complex ways to enrich themselves.
So wait, was the imported legal structure just too complicated, or did it just give pre-existing corruption a much bigger hammer to work with?
It was a disastrous synergy of the two. The source implies that the moral rot was already there.
Right.
And it was just given this incredibly powerful new tool in the form of a European legal system. In theory, that system is for transparency, for rule of law. In practice, the judges were described as immediately open to bribery. The complex bureaucracy, which was supposed to ensure due process, just became a bottleneck.
It created more opportunities for bribes.
Precisely. The required bureaucratic dawdling, as the source calls it, it just produced interminable lawsuits.
That is a nightmare scenario. Instead of speeding up justice, the new system slowed everything down and added all these new layers of extortion.
Exactly. Justice became a commodity, something only the wealthy could afford to wait for.
It turned an institution of order into a machine for elite enrichment.
And that brings us right to the failure of vision at the very top, to the Khedive.
Let's talk about that leadership. The sources keep mentioning the Khedive's grandiosities, these huge, expensive projects. We know he uses the sweat of their toil from the people to build them, but there's this critical line. The Khedives can make no use of them once they're built. Why not?
This is where the critique moves beyond money and into the social fabric, the human factor. See, a leader can order a railway built, but he can't order competence or integrity into existence. The Khedive's ultimate failure is a social one. He only finds subjects among his people, not honest co-workers who can continue the civilizing work after he's moved on.
So there's no middle management, no competent bureaucracy.
There is no middle layer of principled, capable administrators to run a modern state. The source suggests the existing administrative culture, which rewarded loyalty, subservience, grafted, actively pushed away anyone with real integrity or competence. So without that middle layer, the whole structure just depends on the whim of one person.
That's a devastating diagnosis. It means any success is temporary. Stagnation is basically guaranteed once the leaders distracted are gone.
The problem isn't the projects, it's the total lack of capacity to sustain them.
So we've got superficial infrastructure, a corrupt and broken administration, a failure of leadership. But the source doesn't stop there. It pivots to what it sees as the primary structural barrier behind all of this.
Yes.
Education.
Yes.
The assessment is blunt. Reforms are useless as long as education and honest administration are lacking.
This is really the most profound part of the whole critique. The author says the political and administrative problems are just symptoms.
Symptoms of what?
Of a deeper intellectual and moral failure. They describe the education of the people as static, fundamentally rooted in a very specific, inflexible interpretation of Islam. And this leads us directly to the intellectual class who held all the power, who defined what knowledge was, the ulema.
Okay, we need to spend a moment on the ulema. They were much more than just religious teachers, right?
Oh, much more. They were the entire intellectual and judicial backbone of the state. The ulema were the erudite experts in the Quran, and they were seen as the epitome of all wisdom, the sole source of legitimate knowledge.
But there's a catch.
A massive one. The sources say that the teachings of this class professed contempt for all the knowledge in the world which lies outside the holy book.
So if you're trying to import Western science, law, engineering,
And your entire intellectual establishment declares those things worthless or even hostile, well, the knowledge can't be assimilated. It can only be mimicked superficially. And these ulema had immense practical power. They were the expositors of the law, the counselors of the mighty, the teachers of the people, and the educators of youth. They influenced every single future administrator.
so they weren't just spiritual guides, they were the operational, judicial, and educational core of the state. And if that core is actively hostile to outside ideas, I mean, how could modernization ever take root?
It couldn't.
The source calls them the enemies of all Western culture. That's a powerful indictment.
It is, and he also backs it up by looking at the teaching methods. The education in the Quran schools was based on learning mechanically by heart.
Rote memorization.
Pure, uncritical memorization. And the critique argues that this kind of training, it provides an incredibly weak foundation for someone who has to enter the world of complex governance or modern commerce. A man trained only to memorize, not to analyze or apply or critically engage, he cannot possibly be the honest coworker that Khedive was looking for.
Of course not.
This rigid system just guaranteed a supply of subjects who were experts in static knowledge, but totally incapable of dynamic problem solving.
So stagnant knowledge leads directly to stagnant administration. That connection is key. Okay, so let's bring it all back together. The core conclusion from the source is clear. Genuine civilizing reform can't happen until you address these deeper issues of education and public morality.
You can't just order the parts from Europe and build a modern state.
It doesn't work that way.
That's right. And the critique returns to public morality, how it's all tied up with education. The sources observe that public morality is not any higher level than understanding. In other words, if your educated elite are trained in a system that rejects critical thought, how can you expect them to embody integrity as administrators?
You can't.
And the author sadly concludes that honesty was just extremely rare. Upright men were seldom found among officials. Finding religious judges integral to integrity was a rare virtue.
And when integrity is that rare, imported systems that are designed for societies with, established rule of law, they just fail.
They don't import accountability. They just import new, more complex ways for dishonest men to use power.
It's an incredible historical lesson, and it really transcends time and geography, doesn't it? It shows us the huge difference between importing technology, the gaslights, the courts, and actually cultivating the internal capacity, the ethical governance to run them.
The physical stuff is always the easiest part. The cultural and moral shift, that's the real grinding work.
So we've seen how these 19th century efforts in Tripoli, Fezzan, and Tunisia failed. And they failed because they focused on imitation, on appearance, rather than the core consciousness and needs of the people. The superficial changes just crumbled into dust or fueled the corruption that was already there.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to think about. We talked about the ulema, the ruling intellectual class, and their explicit contempt for outside knowledge. So here's the question. If a society's established and respected education system fundamentally views external ideas as inferior or hostile or just unworthy of serious study, how can those external ideas ever truly be assimilated? Or will they always remain what the sources described, just clumsy imitations destined to be corrupted or simply left to collect dust? Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we're looking at something just fascinating. It's a historical journey into Tripoli and Fezzan. And our source material details this period of attempted reform, this big push for modernization.
A push that was defined by, huge ambition, followed by just widespread failure.
Exactly. And we're not talking about small changes. We're talking about massive European-style projects, things that were meant to look completely state-of-the-art.
Railroads, gaslighting, telegraphs.
All the markers of 19th century modernity. And yet, the story the sources tell is one of projects stalling, collapsing, or just being left to rot.
Right.
So the question for us today is, why? Why did these ideas that worked perfectly well elsewhere, meet such incredible resistance here? Okay, let's unpack this.
That really is the core tension, isn't it? The sources are remarkably clear. They see this huge gap between, a surface level imitation of the West and the deep systemic and cultural barriers that just stopped any real progress in its tracks.
And what's so interesting is that they don't just say, oh, it failed.
No, not at all. They get into the why. It's a structural critique, really.
Yeah.
The reform efforts were often tied to the intelligence of the Khedive, the ruler.
And his, what the source calls, feverish ambition to look good.
To look progressive on the world stage, yes.
So let's start there with those grand designs. The sources get really specific about the projects.
They do.
You had, first and foremost, a railroad track, the ultimate symbol of industrial power. Then municipal stuff like an aqueduct or gas lighting for the cities. And of course, the telegraph line to get connected.
These are major high-visibility projects. They cost a fortune.
And yet, what stands out immediately in the reading is the evidence of collapse.
It's almost simultaneous. They're building on one side and it's falling apart on the other.
Or they're just abandoned.
Right.
And not because the idea was bad, but, and I'm quoting here, because of the lack of means and of workers.
Which makes you wonder, right?
It does. If you have the means to start building a railroad, how do you not have the means to finish it?
I think it speaks to the motivation. The sources really suggest the drive wasn't about practical function. It was about that feverish ambition you mentioned.
Looking good for euros.
Exactly. It was about imitating French fashions, European decorations. It was all cosmetic.
A kind of window dressing.
That's a perfect way to put it. And this leads to one of the sharpest observations in the sources, that many who saw themselves as great reformers, especially when reading about themselves in foreign papers, were, at the end of the day, just clumsy imitators.
So they were buying the facade, but not the foundation. What was the result of that?
The sources call these innovations ephemeral, costly, and useless shows.
Wow.
Yeah, they were temporary, they were expensive, and they were displays that lacked the one critical ingredient,
Which was?
the real support of the people. They didn't meet a genuine need. So you have to ask, if you're building something just for international optics, you're not invested in the transformation, only the transaction.
And that guarantees failure. Okay, so that's the external failure, the crumbling infrastructure. But let's go deeper. Let's transition from the projects to the internal state of things, the governance and the economy.
Because this is where it gets really dark.
It does. This is where the imitation of complexity meets the reality of decay. The sources give a great example from Tunis.
The military purchasing.
Yes, a frigate, dispatch boats, troop ships, hundreds of cannon, a huge military buildup. And at the same time, they set up brand new law courts with rights of appeal.
All completely modeled on a European system.
It sounds comprehensive, like a real institutional overhaul.
And it would look fantastic in a report back to London or Paris, but the sources are just brutal about the consequences.
What do they say?
They state very clearly that this entire model of reform actively undermined the prosperity of the country.
It didn't just fail, it made things worse.
Much worse. Instead of creating wealth, it created debt and, well, opportunities for a very select few.
So they explicitly link the reforms to the country's decline.
They do, and they point the finger directly at high officials. The sources say this new complex system was basically a welcome mat for corruption. Reform became the best way for officials to enrich themselves.
But couldn't you argue that just having the courts at all was a step forward, even if they were corrupt?
Well, that's the paradox, isn't it? They introduced complexity without integrity, and that combination is just explosive.
How so?
The sources describe it vividly. Judges were completely open to bribery. If you had a case, you knew the deal. You had to pay for a good outcome.
Or just to avoid a bad one.
Right. And beyond that, you had this institutional inefficiency they call dawdling.
Dawdling.
Deliberately dragging out legal cases, creating interminable lawsuits. Imagine trying to run a business when the legal system is designed to trap you until you pay up.
That kind of complexity doesn't create justice, it just creates paralysis. Massive economic risk.
Exactly. And the economic toll was staggering. All of the Khedive's grandiose creations, the expensive ships, the public works, they were all funded by the sweat of their toil from the people.
So it was all expense, no real growth.
And here's the administrative punchline. The Khedive, the sources say, couldn't find honest co-workers to continue the civilizing work.
So he had the money and the ambition.
He had the blueprints, even. But the human capital, the basic administrative integrity, needed to staff a modern state. It just wasn't there.
Which brings us perfectly to the next layer of the problem, the why. Why this pervasive lack of honest, capable people?